They said Sadie Quinn never spoke. Only her guns did the talking. But when Ash Ridge's worst men came for her blood, the silence beside her spoke louder than any bullet. One girl, one blacksmith, standing shoulder to shoulder against a gang thirsting for revenge. Gunsmoke, dust, and a truth too heavy to carry alone. In that wind-choked square, the fastest draw in the West finally learned the deadliest thing wasn't steel. It was the words she'd buried deeper than her bullets. He whispered it first, voice low but steady. "I'd rather die beside you than run without you." Sadie's eyes never left the barrel aimed at her heart, but her hand found his, and for the first time, her silence meant she was ready to stay. The heat in Ash Ridge that afternoon felt like a dare. Dry wind hissing between sun-bleached storefronts, carrying the stink of sweat, cheap whiskey, and something meaner. The Black Spurs gang leaned against the hitching posts outside the Saloon de Rosa, boots scuffing up dust that clung to their trousers like a curse they couldn't shake. Four of them, shoulders broad, eyes bloodshot from last night's moonshine, and yet they cackled like roosters too drunk to notice the butcher's blade. They laughed at nothing and everything, at the stray dog nosing through trash, at the old man nodding off under his porch awning, and loudest of all, at the sight of her. Sadie Quinn, the silent one. Her shadow appeared first, stretching long across the cracked road like a bad omen, and every one of those drifters felt it, though they'd never admit it. So they laughed harder. One of them, broad-shouldered with a scar running through his beard like lightning splitting a storm, spat into the dust and elbowed the youngest. "Reckon that ghost'll twitch?" he sneered. "Heard she's so fast her own daddy called her a curse." They'd all heard the stories. A stagecoach ambushed up by Dry Creek. 5 men dead before their rifles left the brush. A ranch hand who laid hands on her once and woke up with his boot nailed to the barn door. She never raised her voice, never made a scene, just left a legend to grow in whispers. And that's what made these men talk so loud now. Because legends like that don't die easy. You have to kill the fear before you even think of pulling your gun. Inside the shuttered general store, a boy named Jacob Harper watched from behind a cracked pane of glass. He was 10, maybe 11, his hair sticking to his forehead in the heat, palms pressed so hard into the sill that splinters dug in deep. He'd come to town with his mother for flour and thread. But this was something he'd carry far longer than a spool of string. Through that wavy glass, he saw the way Sadie walked, calm, unhurried, like she was the only person alive in a town full of ghosts. Her boots barely lifted dust. Her hat brim threw a shadow across her eyes, hiding everything but the promise they held. And when the outlaws barked their mockery into the sun, Jacob understood, even if they didn't, that you can't scare a storm by yelling at the sky. Long before Ash Ridge carved Sadie Quinn's name into rumor and fear, there was just a battered corral behind a leaning old church, half swallowed by prairie grass and shadow. It was there, in the late yellow dusk, that a 12-year-old girl with storm cloud eyes taught a boy how to stay on a horse that didn't want him. Dustfoot wasn't much to look at then, ribs showing, mane tangled like briar, his eyes wide and white at the slightest noise. But Sadie loved that colt like a brother she never had, and she trusted him more than she trusted any grown man in town. Luke Holloway, meanwhile, was bony and awkward, elbows scraped raw, chin too sharp for a boy who still flinched when the preacher's belt snapped too close to home. He wanted to learn to ride so bad he'd traded the last coins in his pocket for a chance. The first time Dustfoot bucked, Luke went down so hard the corral dust stuck in his teeth. He lay there staring up at the purple sky, ribs aching, and when he rolled over, Sadie was just standing there, arms folded, face blank. No laughter, no pity. She jerked her chin at the fence rail. "Try again." He did, fell again. Laughed the second time, though, a startled, breathless bark of a laugh that made Dustfoot's ears twitch. Sadie didn't smile, didn't speak. She just caught the colt's bridle, pulled him around, and helped Luke up once more. That was the lesson. If the world throws you off, get back on, and don't expect it to say sorry. After dust settled and the prairie turned blue with shadows, they'd sit cross-legged by the old water tower. Luke would light a stub of a candle and read aloud from whatever he could find. Dime store cowboy adventures with heroes who never lost. Poetry with too many words he didn't understand. Yellowed pages from a Bible his father left behind when the faith dried up like creek water in August. Sadie never said much. Sometimes she'd pretend to sleep, hat pulled down low. But when the candle guttered, Luke would see her eyes still open, fixed on the page. Some nights, if the wind was right, she'd reach out and straighten the paper when it flapped. That was as close as she got to asking him to keep going. But it wasn't all borrowed words and warm nights. Trouble never needed a reason in Ash Ridge. One dusk, they were cutting across the abandoned rail yard when a ranch boy named Ellis, big for 15 and mean from the bone out, decided Luke was too soft for this dust-choked life. Mama's boy with a preacher daddy who couldn't keep a congregation, or a son worth spit, Ellis crowed, flinging rocks like insults. Luke didn't run. He never did. But he didn't fight either. That was when Sadie stepped in. No words, just her fists and a glare that made Ellis's grin crack. He swung back, caught her temple with a ringed knuckle. She stumbled but didn't drop. She didn't cry either, even when her cheek split open like a ripe peach. When it was done, Ellis limped off swearing, and Sadie just sat down in the dirt, breathing hard, blood mixing with the dust. Luke's hands shook when he pressed a torn rag against her cut. He tied it too tight, then too loose, fumbling all over again. She never flinched. Neither of them said thank you. Neither needed to. That was their first pact. Silence could build something tougher than iron, and it would hold. Through years, gunfire, and the secrets neither of them dared name out loud. Years later, the corral was long gone, splintered boards picked clean by wind and time. But Ash Ridge Square still held its shape like a wound that never closed. By then, Sadie Quinn wasn't just the girl who didn't talk. She was a storm in boots and gunmetal, and every drifter in 3 counties knew her name. They called her the Silent One because no words ever left her lips when the bullets started to fly. That day, the sun was so bright it turned every edge of the wooden storefronts into a blade. Heat shimmered above the road like the ghosts of fires long burned out. The Black Spurs gang fanned out in front of the saloon, their spurs tapping against the hitch rail in a mock rhythm of a funeral drum. They cracked jokes about the girl ghost with iron on her hips, each laugh louder than the last. Just noise to keep the fear from crawling up their spines. Sadie heard every word but let it pass through her like wind through tall grass. Inside her head, though, her fear was real, tight and mean as a rattlesnake coiled behind her ribs. Her heart thudded so hard it made her fingertips itch. But fear was an old friend. She'd learned how to turn it to fuel. One breath in, one out. Her palm rested on the worn grip of her Colt, the handle smoothed by years of silent practice. She remembered something Luke Holloway once told her, back when they sat on the church steps as kids. Legends aren't made by the ones bleeding in the street. Legends are made by those peering through dusty windows, too scared to step outside. She never forgot that. The first man stepped forward, boots creaking, eyes squinting against the sun. He tipped his hat, mocking, said something she didn't hear. Her thumb slid over the hammer. He sneered, fingers twitching for his own holster. The town seemed to hold its breath. Even the crows on the church steeple went silent. The first shot cracked so fast it was almost swallowed by the cicadas. His gun never cleared leather. He was dead before he hit the ground. The second man, younger, stupidly brave, drew out of panic. She dropped him too, 2 shots in the chest. The heat rippled around her, the air smelling of blood and black powder. Somewhere, a child screamed. Someone else prayed under their breath. She didn't stay to watch them twitch. Sadie spun on her heel, coat flaring, boots pounding the dry dirt as she bolted for Dustfoot. Her Colt was tied under the half-dead oak at the edge of town, the only thing older than Ash Ridge's broken promises. She could hear the Black Spurs behind her now, rage replacing their easy laughs, gunmetal snapping, free of worn leather. She vaulted into the saddle just as a bullet clipped the post behind her, splinters stinging her cheek. Dustfoot lurched forward, hooves striking sparks from the hardpan. The world blurred. Storefronts vanished into the roar of wind and hooves. A bullet hissed past her ear, too close. She leaned low against the Colt's neck, whispering wordless prayers she'd never speak aloud. The plain opened up before her, endless dry brush and sunburned scrub. No cover, no shelter, just brittle sage and scattered stone. She could feel them chasing. 3 riders now, shadows dancing in the haze behind her. One was gaining, close enough that she could hear his curses over the thunder of hoofbeats. Sadie risked a glance back. A mistake. A pistol barked. Dust exploded under her stirrup, throwing her sideways. She tasted grit, bit her tongue. Another shot, closer still. She pulled Dustfoot hard left, skimming a low rise that dropped into a dry wash. The colt's muscles bunched and flexed beneath her. Every stride a heartbeat she prayed would keep beating. Another outlaw closed in, horse frothing at the bit, his eyes wide with hate and hunger. He leaned from the saddle, reaching for her reins. She let go with one hand, drew her sidearm, fired point blank, but the shot went wide, grazing his shoulder. He howled, grabbed for her again. And then, just when the barrel of his revolver lifted toward her back, another crack split the plain. The outlaw jerked sideways, a red mist blooming in the air. He toppled from his horse like a rag doll. Sadie didn't need to look to know. Somewhere on the ridge, steady as sunrise, Luke Holloway stood with a rifle braced against his shoulder. The boy who once couldn't climb on a skittish horse now stared down the barrel at the worst men in Ash Ridge. She didn't smile, didn't wave, just pressed her heels into Dustfoot's flanks and let the desert swallow her whole, the legend growing, the danger with it. Up on the north ridge, the dry wind whipped Luke Holloway's hair into his eyes as he squinted through the rifle's battered iron sights. He'd never aimed at anything that breathed before. Not a coyote, not a deer, and certainly not a man. His forge back in Ash Ridge still smelled of hot iron and singed leather. He could almost taste it in his mouth now, bitter and safe. That forge had been his excuse for years, a place to hide behind hammers and horseshoes, to work until his shoulders ached and his mind shut out the world's sharp edges. But Sadie was out there now, somewhere across that sprawl of brittle sage and sun-baked stone. He could see the dust trail she left behind, a thin ghost winding through the prairie. 3 black spurs were closing on her fast, their silhouettes rippling in the heat mirage. His hands trembled on the stock, sweat streaking the dirt on his palms. He remembered Old Man Reed, the general store owner, trying to stand up to the black spurs 3 winters ago. Reed had refused to pay their protection tax. Luke had watched from behind the forge window as they dragged Reed behind his own mule team, face scraping the frozen ground. When they found him at dawn, he'd been more ice than man. Lips blue, eyes staring at nothing. No one said a word. No one ever did. He thought about that now as the memory clawed at his gut. It would have been easier, smarter, to stay behind the anvil, to let the lawless tear each other apart while he kept his head down and his metal hot. That was what he'd always done. What his father had told him was the only way to survive when you're soft-boned in a town that feeds on spit and grit. But the memory of Sadie's eyes, that steady storm behind them, anchored him to the ridge. He could almost hear her silence in his head, pushing him forward the way she always had, even when they were kids and he'd wanted to run. He took a breath, held it. The rifle felt alien, cold and heavy, the butt pressing bruises into his shoulder. One of the riders was almost close enough to lean over and snatch Sadie from the saddle. Luke squeezed the trigger. The shot cracked the air so sharp it seemed to silence the entire plain for a heartbeat. The outlaw jerked sideways, a red burst blooming from his chest. He tumbled from his horse, limbs ragdoll loose, and hit the dirt hard enough to leave a scar in the dry earth. Luke felt the recoil rattle all the way down his spine, fear fizzing behind his ribs like lightning in a bottle. His knees almost gave, but he forced himself to steady the barrel again. Another rider ducked low, spurring his horse to circle wide. Luke's heartbeat pounded in his ears. He could run, throw the rifle aside, crawl back to his hammer and tongs. But then he thought of Sadie, her boots in the dust, the way she'd never flinched. He gritted his teeth and whispered to the empty wind, "Not today." He sighted down the barrel, felt the breath stick in his throat. He pulled the trigger a second time. That was courage, not the absence of fear, but standing there, shaking, and doing it anyway. When the dust of Ash Ridge finally settled and the black spurs dead were carted off to shallow graves, The town did what towns always do, pretended the blood never stained its doorsteps. The saloon laughter returned, though it never seemed as loud. The forge rang with steel on steel, but Luke Holloway's hammer strikes felt hollow, echoing off the walls of his empty shop. And Sadie Quinn? She went back to silence. But this time, it didn't feel like strength. It felt like punishment. At dusk, she'd saddle up Dustfoot, the colt's flanks dusty with sweat before they even left the corral. She'd ride out past the low ridge where grass gave way to brittle pine, and the land fell into lonely hollows. There, where no one could see her, she set up a row of battered tin cans on fence posts, crooked teeth grinning in the moonlight. She fired until the revolver's chamber glowed warm in her palm, until her fingers blistered and cracked. Each shot split the night like a confession she couldn't say out loud. Sometimes she'd miss on purpose, just to feel that sting in her gut, to remind herself she wasn't perfect, that she could fail. And when the bullets ran out, she'd sit in the dirt, boots scuffed, watching fireflies blink through the scrub, as if they might carry her secrets off into the dark. The truth was, it wasn't the gunfight that haunted her. Not the blood, not the bodies. It was the look in Luke's eyes when the last shot fell silent. That quiet hope, so raw it felt like she'd torn it straight from his chest and thrown it back in his face. She knew what he'd wanted her to say, knew the words coiled up in her throat like a snake that wouldn't strike. But Sadie Quinn had spent her whole life surviving by locking her voice behind her teeth. Speaking it, saying she was more afraid of loving him than any bullet, felt bigger than any battle she'd fought. Some nights back at her rented room above the feed store, she'd drag out an old scrap of paper. The corners were soft, the lines crooked from being folded and unfolded too many times. She'd press the stub of a pencil to it, breathing through her teeth like she was stitching up her own skin. Luke, I don't know how to carry all this. I'm sorry. I never stopped fighting for you. She'd stare at the words until they blurred, tears she'd never admit stinging the corners of her eyes. But come dawn, the paper would always find its way into the fireplace, flames licking at the pencil marks like they were secrets meant to stay buried. The ash would drift up her fingers, tiny ghosts of the truth she wouldn't let live. In town, Luke sometimes caught sight of her. Dust on her boots, shadows under her eyes, hands wrapped tight in cloth to hide the blisters. He wanted to ask her why she never came by the forge anymore. Wanted to ask if the silence between them could be mended. But the same fear that locked her voice shut his too. So they circled each other, orbiting like stars afraid to collide. The space between them bigger than any outlaw's bullet ever was. The wind came in first, hot, restless, carrying dust and whispers through Ash Ridge's narrow alleys. By the time the black spurs crawled back into town, the shutters were already drawn tight, and mothers pulled children inside like prayers in the throat. They were fewer now, only 4 riders left. But that made them more dangerous than before. Grief had hollowed them out, and hate boiled under their coats, hotter than any rot-gut whiskey they'd ever swallowed. They wore their pistols like funeral garlands, each man's eyes bloodshot and mean, looking for someone to pay for the friends they'd buried in shallow graves past the dry creek. They tied their horses at the same hitching post in front of the Saloon de Rosa, boots dragging through the square like thunder that hadn't found the rain yet. Their leader, broad-shouldered, a scar splitting his lip in two, spat a dark stream into the dirt. "Time to finish what that ghost girl started," he growled, voice hoarse from dust and rage. Inside the feed store, Sadie Quinn stood by the counter, her hat brim low enough to hide the flicker in her eyes. She'd come for oats but found something heavier waiting for her. Martha Grace, a widow who'd lost her husband to these same outlaws years back, reached below the counter. Her hands shook, but her voice did not. She slid an old battered box across the wood. "My daddy's bullets," she said, thumb brushing the faded brass. "He'd want you to have 'em. Don't let them men take any more from this town." Sadie didn't thank her. She didn't have the words for that. She just tipped her hat, turned, and stepped back into the rising heat. At the forge, Luke Holloway had no illusions left. He'd watched enough blood run between these dusty boards to know it could all come down to a moment's tremor in your trigger hand. So he worked the lead himself, melting and pouring each bullet into molds he'd carved the night before. His hammer strikes were steady, ringing out over the hush that settled on the empty street beyond his shop. Each slug he forged carried the promise that fear didn't get to win this time. When the sun climbed high enough to turn the square into a white-hot stage, they came together. Sadie Quinn and Luke Holloway, standing shoulder to shoulder in the open. She wore her iron low on her hips, coat pushed back just enough for everyone to see she'd come ready. Dust clung to her boots and her hair was tied back rough, but her eyes were calm, storm clouds biding their time. Luke stepped up beside her, sweat drying on his neck, forge apron tossed aside for a faded shirt, and sleeves rolled to his elbows. His hammer hung at his belt like an old habit he hadn't bothered to shake. In his other hand, his home-forged Colt rested easy. He'd never drawn on a man in daylight before, but the feel of the steel against his palm steadied the drumbeat in his chest. Across the square, the black spurs fanned out, boots grinding grit, spurs chiming like death bells. The scarred leader sneered, baring yellowed teeth. "Look at that! The silent one and her dog-smith boy. Think you're gonna hold us off with your love letters and your ghost stories?" Sadie didn't answer. Her hand drifted to her holster, thumb brushing the hammer. That was all the answer he'd get. One of the younger spurs spat at Luke's boots. "Ain't you gonna run back to your anvil, Holloway? Let the girl bleed for you like she always does?" Luke's jaw twitched. He glanced at Sadie, just once, then spoke for both of them. "Not today." The air went dead still. A dog whimpered from beneath a porch. A shutter banged loose in the wind. And in that heartbeat between what was and what would be, Sadie and Luke's shoulders brushed, the warmth between them more solid than any promise they'd ever spoken. The scarred leader barked a laugh that died in his throat. "Then dig your own graves," he hissed, hand flying to his revolver. The square exploded in gunfire, thunder cracking off wood and stone. Sadie moved first, a blur of black coat and iron, each shot true as the stories whispered in every saloon from here to Dry Creek. Luke's draw was slower, but steady. His first shot spun one man backward, his second dropped another to the dirt before the outlaw's curse could leave his lips. Dust and smoke curled around them, hot as the forge they'd built their stubborn hope on. When it cleared, 3 black spurs lay still. The last man, the young one who'd mocked them, dropped his gun, eyes wide, boots slipping as he turned and ran for his life down the alley behind the old stable. Silence settled. The wind pushed a torn scrap of cloth across the blood-specked street. Sadie holstered her Colts with a grace that spoke of practice and pain, then let her hand fall to her side, close enough that Luke could feel the heat of it when he finally stepped close. No more running, not for her, not for him, not ever again. When the last echo of gunfire drifted off into the hills, Ash Ridge finally let its shoulders drop. Folks stepped back onto their porches, boots scuffing familiar boards, eyes softer than they'd been in years. Neighbors lingered at fences, trading whispers like currency, about how the silent one and the blacksmith had faced down death and then walked right into the life they'd always deserved. They didn't choose a fine house in town or a big spread with a name on a gate. Instead, they built what they could at the edge of the broken ridge, where the prairie wind cuts sharp in the winter, but the grass comes back strong each spring. A crooked barn with rusted hinges, a split-rail corral that leans just enough to make you smile, a porch that creaks so loud you'd swear it's singing when the wind rolls in from the west. It's not perfect, but it's theirs, and in this land, that means more than gold. Each Wednesday, you'll find Sadie behind that barn, lining up a handful of ranch kids with eyes too big for their boots. She shows them how to stand their ground, breathe through the tremble, and never pull a trigger from anger. Behind the house, Luke keeps his forge warm for the older boys who've got more fight than sense. He teaches them how to strike iron without losing themselves to the fire inside. And when the sun dips low and the oil lamp on the porch flickers like a heartbeat, they sit shoulder to shoulder on those old steps. No words needed, just the hush of a promise that sometimes silence, shared with the right soul, is the greatest victory of all. Out in Ash Ridge, a gun might have settled a score, but it was the silence after that proved who you really were. Sadie and Luke's story reminds us that sometimes the hardest battles aren't the ones fought with bullets, but the ones fought in our own hearts. To stay, to stand beside someone, to speak the words that scare us most. We may not live under the same sun-baked sky, but we all face moments when it's easier to shut the door than to reach out. Maybe it's telling someone you're sorry. Maybe it's forgiving an old grudge. Or maybe, like Sadie, it's finding the courage to trust someone when life's always taught you to run. So here's what we'd love to know. What part of this story echoes in your own life? Who's the person you'd stand beside, no matter the storm? Or what truth would you fight for, even if your voice shook? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your story might help someone else find their voice too. Thank you for sitting a while with us on this dusty trail of hope and quiet courage. If this tale spoke to your heart, give it a thumbs up, share it with someone you trust, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that remind us. Even in the Wild West, and in our lives today, sometimes the strongest words are the ones we finally dare to say.